I spent most of my life running around the forests of southern Oregon. The deeper you go, the more you realize how little you really know about what's out there. The trees, the terrain, the abandoned logging roads that lead nowhere. There's a kind of silence in those woods that can make your mind play tricks on you. But sometimes it's not your mind. Sometimes the woods just don't make sense. It was late summer, years ago, when my friend and I decided to go deep into the backcountry, far beyond any maintained trails or known roads. We had 2 dogs with us, both of them experienced out in the wild, well-trained, and never the type to spook easily. It was one of those dry, hot afternoons where the heat radiates off the dirt, and everything smells like pine sap and dust. We had parked miles back at an old logging spur, the kind barely visible anymore, overgrown with ferns and brambles. From there, we hiked in with our gear, planning to do some off-trail exploring before setting up camp. The terrain out there is rough, dense underbrush, fallen logs, and hills that never seem to stop rolling. It's easy to get turned around if you're not careful. But we had a map, a compass, and years of experience between us. We weren't worried. About 3 hours in, after cutting through a particularly thick section of forest, we came across something unexpected. A fence. Not just any fence, either. A 10-foot-tall chain-link fence, running in both directions as far as we could see, buried deep in the middle of nowhere. No signs, no markings. The metal was weathered but sturdy, not sagging like some old, forgotten property line. It was intact, maintained. Through the gaps in the links, we could see rows of trees planted inside. At first, it just looked like an organized grove, something the Forest Service might have set up for research. But after a few minutes of looking, we realized something was off. Every tree was bent. Not naturally, like from wind or damage, but deliberately shaped. They all had the same crooked curve, as if someone had forced them to grow that way. The sight of it was unsettling. Not in an obviously dangerous way, but in that quiet, creeping way that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The dogs were tense. One of them, my friend's retriever, started whining, ears back, staring into the trees inside the fence. My dog, a tough old mutt who wasn't afraid of much, backed up behind me. Something about the place felt wrong. We didn't climb the fence. Maybe we should have, maybe we shouldn't have. But when you're deep in the woods and your dogs, who never act like this, are trying to leave, you listen. We backed away, kept moving, and tried to shake off the feeling that we had just stumbled onto something we weren't meant to see. We tried to find that place again, months later. Spent an entire weekend retracing our steps. But it was gone. No fence, no strangely bent trees, just endless forest, stretching in every direction. That wasn't the only strange thing we found out there. Another time, same friend, same dogs, same deep, middle-of-nowhere part of the woods. We were dry camping. No tent, just sleeping bags and a tarp. It was the kind of camping where you carry everything in and pack everything out. The kind where you don't expect to see another person for days. We had spent most of the afternoon hiking, letting the dogs run ahead and explore while we followed game trails and old, barely there footpaths. Sometime around late afternoon, we found a small clearing that caught our attention. It wasn't the kind of place that had been logged or used for anything official. It was too remote for that. But someone had lived there a long time ago. In the middle of the clearing was an old, rusted iron bed frame, the kind you'd expect to see in an abandoned farmhouse. It was partially sunken into the dirt, covered in patches of moss. Nearby, there was a small cook stove, also rusted out, and a few scattered metal buckets, their sides eaten away by time and weather. There were no walls, no remains of a cabin or shelter. Just these strange, rusted objects, left behind in the middle of the wilderness. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the kind of place you could drive to. There were no nearby roads, not even an old logging road. The nearest trail was miles away, and even that was barely used. Whoever had lived out here, because someone had lived here, hadn't wanted to be found, and they hadn't made it easy to get to. The dogs were uneasy again. Not as bad as with the fence, but still on edge, sniffing around, tails low. My friend and I stood there for a long time, looking at the rusted bed frame, the cook stove, the way the clearing seemed almost too quiet. There were no birds, no wind. We didn't stay there long. That night, back at our camp, neither of us said much about it. But as we lay under the stars, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, I kept thinking about that bed. How long had it been there? Who had slept in it? Why so deep in the woods? And more importantly, where did they go? People like to talk about the spooky side of the woods. The stories about things watching from the trees, about lost hikers vanishing without a trace. I've heard plenty of those. But the truth is, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the places that shouldn't exist. The places you find once and never again. The places that make you feel, deep down, that you shouldn't be there. And sometimes, when you're out there alone, miles from anywhere, you realize you might not be the first person to think that. Some places don't want to be found. I believe that now. Last September, I decided to hike a remote stretch of forest in northern Montana. No established trails, just old logging roads and animal paths. My plan was simple. Hike about 15 miles into the wilderness, camp for a few nights near a secluded lake, and then head back. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but something about this one felt different from the start. The first day went smoothly. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in my lungs. I followed a faint game trail up a ridge, moving deeper into the wild. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing and set up camp. I was completely alone, or so I thought. As I sat by my small fire, watching the last light fade behind the trees, I heard it. A whistle. Short, sharp, somewhere in the trees beyond my camp. I froze, every hair on my body standing up. It wasn't the sound of a bird. It was too deliberate, too human. I waited, listening. Nothing. Probably my mind playing tricks, I told myself. The wind. An animal. I shook it off and crawled into my tent. But sleep didn't come easy. The second day, things got worse. I packed up and continued deeper into the woods. The game trail faded, forcing me to navigate by map and compass. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. Something was wrong with the forest. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. Just an oppressive, unnatural silence. Then I noticed the trees. They were marked. Every so often, I passed a tree with deep scratches gouged into the bark, long, deliberate slashes. At first, I thought they were from bears, but they were too uniform, too precise. I stopped to examine one. The cuts were deep, fresh. Something had been here recently. A shiver ran down my spine. I kept moving, faster now. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was exactly as I had hoped, calm, remote, untouched. A perfect campsite. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. As I gathered firewood, I found another tree. More marks. Only this time, there was something else. A symbol, carved deep into the wood. A crude shape, almost like an eye. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. I wasn't alone out here. That night, the forest came alive. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, something woke me. A snapping twig, the rustle of brush, a low, distant sound, a whistle. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, careful, moving just outside my camp. I held my breath, gripping my knife, staring at the thin fabric of my tent. My mind screamed at me to unzip the door, shine my light, look. But I couldn't. I stayed frozen, waiting. The footsteps circled my tent once. Then twice. Then nothing. Minutes passed. An hour. Silence. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slipped into uneasy sleep. Morning came, and I knew I had to leave. I packed up in record time, stuffing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. I needed to get out of these woods. That's when I saw the footprints. All around my camp. Bare footprints. Human. No shoes. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Someone, or something, had been standing outside my tent while I slept. My stomach turned to ice. I grabbed my pack and started moving, practically running back the way I had come. But the trail was gone. I stopped, breathing hard, my heart hammering. I had followed a clear path up here. I had marked my route. But now nothing looked familiar. The forest had changed. Or worse, someone had changed it. Panic set in fast. I checked my compass. The needle spun wildly before settling in the wrong direction. My gut told me it was wrong, but I had no choice. I moved as fast as I could, pushing through thick undergrowth. The forest felt different now. Denser, darker. And then I saw it. A tree with the same symbol carved into it. The same one I had seen by the lake. I had been walking for hours. I was going in circles. I slammed my fist against the tree, my breath ragged. I needed to think. Then something moved. A shape just beyond the trees. A figure. Watching me. I barely saw him before he disappeared into the brush. No clothes, just pale skin, gone in an instant. I ran. I didn't care where, I just ran. Branches tore at my arms, my pack thumped against my back, but I didn't stop. The whole time, I could hear something behind me, following, not running, not chasing, just walking, letting me know it was still there. I don't know how long I ran. At some point, I stumbled onto an old logging road. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I forced myself to keep moving. And then I saw it. A cabin, small, rundown, sitting at the edge of the tree line. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was there. I nearly collapsed as I reached the door, pounding on it with shaking fists. A man opened it. Old. Weathered. His eyes scanned me, taking in my wild, desperate state. "Got lost, did you?" His voice was calm. Too calm. I nodded frantically, gasping for air. He didn't look surprised. Didn't ask where I had come from. Just opened the door. I hesitated. Something inside me screamed not to go in. Behind me, the forest stood silent, watching, waiting. Then the old man stepped aside, and on the floor, just inside the cabin, bare footprints. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not until I reached my car, hours later. I don't know how I found my way back. I don't know who or what was out there. But I do know one thing. Some places don't want to be found, and some things don't want you to leave. Utah's backcountry is an unforgiving place. Vast stretches of desert, steep canyons, and miles of rocky cliffs make it beautiful, but also brutal. It's the kind of place where you can feel truly alone. No roads, no towns, no cell service, just you and the wilderness. That's exactly why I loved it. I had planned a 3-day solo hike through a remote part of the desert. The route would take me through winding sandstone canyons and open plateaus before I reached a natural spring where I intended to camp. I started early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the cliffs. The first day was perfect, clear skies, cool air, and total solitude. I moved at a steady pace, stopping only to take in the view or check my map. But by late afternoon, as I climbed a ridge to get a better look at my route, I saw him. A man, standing on a distant ridge, completely still. He was facing my direction, but he was too far away for me to make out any details. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't expecting to see anyone out here. This was not a well-traveled area. The nearest trailhead was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single sign of another person all day. I hesitated, then lifted a hand in a casual wave. He didn't move. I frowned. Maybe he hadn't seen me? I turned back to my path, shaking off the unease. It was probably just another hiker. No reason to be concerned. But as I made my way down into the canyon, a thought nagged at me. Why was he just standing there? I reached the bottom of the canyon just as the sun started to dip below the cliffs. The shadows stretched long, and the air cooled quickly. I found a good spot near the natural spring, a small pool of clear water surrounded by smooth rock. I set up camp, boiled some water for dinner, and stretched out by my tent, listening to the quiet desert sounds. The distant call of an owl, the rustling of a light breeze through dry grass, and then something else. A faint crunch, footsteps on gravel. I sat up, my body going rigid. The sound had come from somewhere nearby. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dry rock and desert scrub. Nothing moved. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Maybe it had been a small animal. A coyote, a jackrabbit, something harmless. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight, and gripped my knife in one hand as I lay there, listening. It was a long time before I fell asleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Close. Too close. I held my breath, heart hammering. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Shallow. Quiet. Just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I tightened my grip on my knife, trying to keep my breath silent. My mind raced. Who was out there? Why weren't they saying anything? Then, the zipper of my tent moved. Not much. Just a slight pull, the sound of metal scraping against fabric. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to do something. I clenched my jaw, forced myself to move, and in one quick motion, I flicked on my flashlight and ripped the zipper open. The light spilled out into the night. No one was there. I shined the beam in every direction, scanning the rocks and scrub around my campsite. My breath came in fast, uneven gasps. My hands shook. I was alone. But I wasn't. Someone had been right there. I had heard them. I stayed up the rest of the night, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, scanning the darkness every few minutes. But nothing else happened. At first light, I packed my gear as fast as I could. My plan had been to continue my hike, but I wasn't going to risk another night out here. I started back the way I had come, moving quickly. My body was exhausted, but the fear kept me going. Every now and then, I stopped to listen, scanning the ridges and cliffs around me. And then I saw him again, standing on a ridge, farther away this time, but still facing me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was the same man from before, still wearing no visible gear, still completely still. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew he was watching me. A deep, primal fear surged through me. I turned and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. My legs burned as I scrambled over rocks, pushing myself as fast as I could. I didn't care if I dropped something. I just had to get out. The whole time, I could feel it, that sense of being watched. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my pack into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the desert, waiting for something, someone, to appear. But the ridge was empty. I never saw him again. But I know he was real, and I know he was following me. There's a certain kind of peace that comes with being deep in the woods, away from roads, trails, and the constant hum of civilization. That peace is what I was chasing when I set out on a solo backpacking trip in the Appalachians. I had a 3-day route planned, but as always, I didn't intend to stick to marked campsites. I like finding my own spots, places that felt untouched, where I could feel truly alone. I knew how to navigate, how to stay safe, and I carried everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, knife, and a small hatchet. The first day of hiking was uneventful. The air was cool, the leaves still thick on the trees despite it being late autumn. I took my time, following the narrow, winding trail for several miles before veering off when I found a promising area. A clearing on a small ridge, far from any official campsite. It was perfect, flat ground, a good view of the surrounding forest, and just far enough from a stream that I could hear the water but wouldn't be kept up by it. I set up my tent, gathered wood for a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dropped, the sky turned a deep orange, then purple, then black. There was no moon that night, and without it, the woods became absolute darkness beyond the reach of my fire. I had been alone in the wilderness plenty of times before, but something about that night felt different. I ignored the feeling, assuming it was just the natural unease that came with being truly alone in the woods. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the distant sound of the stream and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Then I heard something else, a deliberate, slow movement in the trees. I tensed. It wasn't the scurrying of a squirrel or the quick steps of a deer. It was slow, like something, or someone, trying to be quiet. I turned toward the sound, straining my eyes against the dark. My firelight didn't reach far enough, and beyond that, the woods were pure blackness. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it in the direction of the noise. Nothing. Just trees, their trunks standing motionless in the cold night air. I stayed like that for a while, heart pounding, light sweeping back and forth, but I saw no movement, no eyes reflecting back at me. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe. I put out my fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I don't know what woke me up first, the silence or the whispering. I lay there, staring up at the fabric of my tent, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The fire was out now, leaving me in complete darkness. The woods were silent. No wind, no insects, just heavy, suffocating stillness. Then I heard it again, a whisper, low, unintelligible, just outside my tent. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. I slowly reached for my knife, my fingers shaking as I wrapped them around the handle. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to see. The whispering stopped. I held my breath, heart hammering against my ribs. The seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half asleep dreaming. Then the zipper of my tent moved. Just a little. Just enough to make a sound. I reacted without thinking. I flicked on my flashlight and ripped the zipper open. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. Just trees and dead leaves. My breath came in ragged gasps as I shined the light in every direction. There was no one there. But something had been. I sat there, gripping my knife, waiting for the adrenaline to fade. It didn't. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in my tent, flashlight in one hand, blade in the other, listening. But the whispering never came back. At first light, I packed up my camp in record time. I had planned to stay in the woods for another night, but I wasn't going to push my luck. I started hiking back toward the trail, moving quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was still there, stronger than ever. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Bare human footprints in the dirt, circling my campsite. I stopped cold, my stomach twisting. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been there the night before. I had been alone. Or at least I had thought I was. I don't remember the rest of the hike. I only remember moving fast, barely stopping to rest, pushing myself to get out of the woods as quickly as possible. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors before even catching my breath. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the trees, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had someone been watching me? Following me? Whispering outside my tent in the middle of the night? I don't know. But I do know this. I never camp off trail alone anymore. And I never ignore that feeling of being watched. I have always loved hiking alone. There is something about the quiet, the steady rhythm of my steps, and the isolation that makes me feel at peace. Out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of civilization, my mind clears. It's just me, the trail, and the endless expanse of nature. At least, that's how it used to feel. This happened 2 summers ago. I had taken a week off work and driven out to a national forest known for its dense, untouched wilderness. My plan was a 5-day solo hike through a remote part of the forest, following an old, unmarked trail I had read about in a hiker's journal. It was supposed to be challenging, with rough terrain and no clear path in some areas, but I wanted the experience of being completely alone. I packed light: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, a small first aid kit, and my knife. No gun. I had never needed one before. I should have brought one. The first day of hiking was everything I had hoped for. The trail was rugged but beautiful, winding through thick pine forests and steep ridges with breathtaking views. I didn't see a single person all day, and by evening, I had set up camp near a small, fast-moving stream. I ate a quick meal, watched the sky darken, and crawled into my tent. The air was crisp, the sound of running water soothing. I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The forest was silent except for the distant murmur of the stream. I lay still, my breath slow, listening. Then I heard it, a rustling sound. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was deliberate, slow. I held my breath. It was close. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, my heart hammering in my chest. Then silence. For a long time, I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting. But there were no more sounds. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted back to sleep, convincing myself it had just been a small animal, maybe a deer passing through. I was wrong. I woke at dawn, feeling uneasy but rested. Stepping out of my tent, I scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place. The forest was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows between the trees. But something felt off. I shook the feeling and packed up, eager to get moving. The trail became more difficult as I climbed higher into the hills, the trees growing denser, the path almost disappearing in places. By midday, I stopped for lunch, sitting on a fallen log, enjoying the solitude. Then I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. Fresh. Large. I froze, staring at it. The print was deep, the edges crisp, as if it had been made just hours ago. It was facing the direction I had come from. Someone had been following me. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up my spine. I stood slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sign of anyone. I told myself it was probably just another hiker. Maybe someone who had passed through earlier in the morning. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I hiked hard for the rest of the day, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whoever had left that footprint. By the time I made camp, I was exhausted. I found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees and set up my tent. As darkness settled, I built a fire, the flickering light casting long shadows around me. I tried to shake the paranoia creeping into my thoughts. I was alone. I had to be. I forced myself to eat, to relax. I listened to the crackling fire, the chirping insects, the rustling leaves in the breeze. But then, a sound, a snap, a branch breaking somewhere in the trees. I froze, my body instantly alert. Silence. Then another snap. Closer. My heart pounded. My knife was already in my hand. I forced myself to breathe. It was probably an animal. A deer, a raccoon, something harmless. I stood slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing. But the feeling was back. That terrible, creeping sensation of being watched. I stepped toward the trees, raising my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the darkness. For a second, just a second, I saw something. A shape. Tall. Motionless. Watching me. And then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed up and left. I had planned for 5 days, but I was done. I needed to get out. I hiked fast, almost running, my legs burning as I pushed forward. The forest felt different now. The trees seemed darker, the silence heavier. Every so often, I glanced behind me. I never saw anything, but I knew it was there. Following. Watching. By midday, I reached a clearing with a steep drop-off to one side, overlooking a deep valley. That's when I heard it. A low guttural sound. Not human. Not an animal. Something in between. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. The trees at the edge of the clearing were shifting, moving. Something was there. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I had covered nearly 15 miles before I finally stopped, my body screaming for rest. The sun was setting, and I had no choice but to camp one more night. I found a spot near a rocky outcrop where I could put my back to something solid. I built a fire, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. The woods were silent. Too silent. I sat awake for hours, staring into the darkness. Then, a whisper. Right behind me. I spun, knife raised, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. The fire flickered. The trees loomed. Then, footsteps. Soft. Slow. Circling my camp. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. It was there. Watching. Waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I didn't sleep. At first light, I ran. I didn't care about the trail. I didn't care about my gear. I just needed to get out. The forest blurred around me as I pushed forward, every shadow, every sound, setting my nerves on fire. Then, a break in the trees. The road. My car. I nearly sobbed with relief as I stumbled toward it, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. As I yanked open the door, I felt it. That last, terrible sensation. I turned, and I saw it. At the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Tall. Motionless. Watching. And then, it stepped back and disappeared into the forest. I never went back. I love hiking alone. Some people think it's reckless, maybe even stupid, but I enjoy the solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being completely cut off from the world. There's something peaceful about being miles deep into the wilderness with no one around. Or at least, that's how I used to feel. This happened 3 years ago. I was hiking in the Adirondacks, following a rugged, lesser-known trail through thick forest and rolling hills. It was a 3-day solo trip, just me, my gear, and the trail. The first day was uneventful. Perfect, even. The weather was crisp and cool, the trees thick with late summer green. I hiked about 10 miles before setting up camp near a small, clear stream. Cooked a simple meal, watched the sunset through the trees, and went to sleep under a sky full of stars. I woke early the next morning, packed up, and kept going. By noon, I reached a fork in the trail. My map told me both paths would eventually meet again, but one was longer and looped through a more remote section of the woods. I chose that one. I had no reason for it. Maybe I wanted more solitude. Maybe I just wanted to see something new. I had no idea what I was walking into. I had been hiking the new trail for about an hour when I saw him. A lone hiker, maybe 100 yards ahead, walking in the same direction. I was surprised. I hadn't seen a single person all day. He was moving slow, almost sluggish, and I caught up quickly. As I got closer, I noticed he was wearing an old, faded green jacket and a large, heavy pack. His gait was odd, stiff, like he was limping slightly. I called out a friendly, "Hey there." He didn't respond. I figured he hadn't heard me, so I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. A weird feeling crept up my spine. Something about him was off. I was close enough now to see the back of his head. His dark hair was long and matted, like he hadn't washed it in months. His shoulders were hunched, and his arms hung awkwardly at his sides. Something told me not to pass him. I slowed my pace, keeping a careful distance behind him. My footsteps crunched against the dirt and leaves, and finally, he seemed to notice me. He stopped. I stopped too. For a long moment, he just stood there, not turning around, not saying anything, just standing. Then, without a word, he stepped off the trail and disappeared into the trees. I waited, listening. Nothing. I should have kept walking. I should have let it go. But something about the way he had moved, so stiff, so unnatural, made my skin crawl. I stepped forward and peered into the trees where he had gone. He was gone. No movement, no sound. Just the thick, empty woods. And that was the first time I felt it. That quiet, creeping dread. That feeling that something was very, very wrong. I hiked fast after that. Something about that man unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just that he had ignored me. It was the way he moved, the way he disappeared so suddenly. I wanted to put distance between us. By late afternoon, I started looking for a place to set up camp. The sun was getting low, and I didn't want to be on the trail after dark. That's when I saw the cabin. It was just off the trail, nestled between the trees. Small, old, and half hidden by thick underbrush. I stopped, staring at it. I hadn't seen it on the map. I don't know what made me walk toward it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something else. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. The walls were weathered and dark with age. The windows were black, empty. The door was slightly open, swinging gently in the breeze. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I stepped onto the porch, my boots creaking against the rotting wood. I pushed the door open wider, peering inside. The smell hit me first. Rot, damp wood, something else, something sour. The interior was dark, but enough light filtered through the broken windows to make out the shape of a table, a rusted stove, and something in the far corner. A sleeping bag. Old. Faded. Torn in places. Someone had been here. Maybe recently. I felt that creeping dread again, stronger now. Like I was standing somewhere I shouldn't be. I backed away, stepping off the porch. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Fresh in the dirt. Leading away from the cabin. And into the woods. I didn't camp near the cabin. I hiked another half-mile before stopping, choosing a spot where I could see in all directions. I built a fire, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. But as the night deepened, the feeling got worse. Something was watching me. I could feel it. I sat close to the fire, my back to a large rock, my knife in my lap. Every few minutes, I shined my flashlight into the trees, searching. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. Then, a sound. Soft. Barely there. A footstep. My breath caught. I gripped my knife tighter. Slowly, I raised my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. The beam landed on something. A figure. Standing just beyond the fire's reach. The man from the trail. Only now I could see his face. Pale. Gaunt. Hollow eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. He stood there, perfectly still, his arms hanging limp at his sides. Watching me. My body locked up. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something. But I couldn't. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed up and left. I hiked fast, almost running. My skin crawled with the feeling that I was being followed, but I didn't dare look back. The trail twisted through dense forest, every turn making me more anxious. I needed to get out. I needed to get back to my car. Then up ahead, a figure, walking toward me. I nearly collapsed with relief when I saw it was another hiker. A man mid-40s, wearing a bright red jacket. He looked normal, solid, safe. He waved. "Hey there." I stopped, trying to catch my breath. "Hey." My voice came out shakier than I wanted. "Everything okay?" He frowned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated. Then, finally, I said, "I saw someone. A man. He was just standing there, watching me." The hiker's expression darkened. "What did he look like?" I told him. His face went pale. "I saw him too," he said quietly. My stomach dropped. "When?" "Yesterday." His voice was low, almost a whisper. But that's not possible. I swallowed hard. Why? He took a deep breath. Because I saw him walk off a cliff. Silence. A long, awful silence. I was hiking near Devil's Pass, he continued. I saw him ahead of me. Same green jacket, same weird way of moving. I tried calling out to him, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking. His voice wavered. I saw him step off the edge. I felt cold, my mind spinning. I ran to the cliff, he said. Looked over. He shook his head. But there was nothing there. The first time I saw him, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was late afternoon, maybe an hour or two before sunset, and I was hiking alone through a remote stretch of forest in the Pacific Northwest. I had planned a 2-day trip, just me, my gear, and the trail. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. The trail itself was well-worn but empty. I hadn't seen another person all day. That's why it took me a second to process what I was seeing. Through the trees, maybe 100 feet off trail, a figure stood motionless among the trunks. At first, he was barely more than a shape, a dark outline against the green and brown of the forest. I thought it was a tree at first, but as I kept walking, something felt wrong. I stopped, looked again. It was a man, not moving, not hiking, just standing. He was too far away for me to make out any details. His clothes were dark, blending into the trees. No bright jacket, no visible gear, nothing that screamed fellow hiker. Just a man, standing there watching. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't scared yet, not exactly, but every instinct in my body was telling me something was off. My brain scrambled for logical explanations. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was a hunter, or a ranger, or some other kind of outdoorsman. But if he was, why wasn't he moving? Why was he watching me? I forced myself to look away, to keep walking. My heart was beating a little faster now, and I had the sudden, ridiculous urge to run. But I didn't. I kept my pace steady, my boots crunching against the dirt and fallen leaves. Every few steps, I glanced back. He was gone. I tried to shake the unease as I continued along the trail. Maybe I had imagined him. Or maybe he had simply moved on, walking deeper into the forest. Either way, I had miles to go before I reached my campsite for the night. I walked faster. By the time the sun was low in the sky, the trees had started to thin. My map told me I was approaching a small clearing where I had planned to set up camp. It was a good spot, flat ground, close to a stream, with enough tree cover to block the wind. But as I stepped into the clearing, my stomach dropped. There he was, closer this time, standing at the far edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a thick pine tree. Still motionless, still watching. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. He was no more than 50 feet away now, close enough that I should have been able to make out details, his face, his clothes. But somehow I couldn't. His features were wrong, unclear, like my brain refused to fully register them. I forced myself to speak, my voice too loud in the quiet. "Hey, you okay?" No response. He just stood there, silent. Something inside me snapped. My hands clenched into fists, and I fought the urge to back away. I was tired, hungry, and I had no patience for whatever this was. "Do you need something?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing. Then, he moved. Not forward, not back. Just slightly, subtly, like shifting weight from one foot to the other. A tiny movement, but enough to send my pulse skyrocketing. I took a slow step back. Then another. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I needed to get out of there. My brain was screaming now, every survival instinct on high alert. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped behind the tree and disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. I had hiked another mile before finally setting up camp, choosing a spot where I could see in all directions. I built a fire, my hands shaking slightly as I stacked the wood. The flames felt like a shield, pushing back the dark. But they couldn't push back the feeling that I was being watched. Every noise set me on edge, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see him standing there at the edge of the firelight. But he never appeared. At some point, exhaustion took over. My head dropped forward, my eyes fluttered closed. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up, because something woke me. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering shadows. The air was still. The forest was silent. Too silent. Then, a sound. Soft, barely audible. Footsteps. Coming from just beyond the fire's reach. I gripped my knife tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, landing on the trees. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I swept the light in a slow arc, searching. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. Still nothing. Then, just as I started to lower the flashlight, I saw him, standing between the trees, just at the edge of the light, closer than before. I sucked in a sharp breath. He was so close now that I could almost make out his face. Almost. But the moment my light landed on him, he moved. Fast. Too fast. A blur of dark clothing and shifting shadows, vanishing into the trees before my brain could process it. My body locked up. Every muscle screamed at me to run, to move, to do something. But I couldn't. I just sat there, gripping my knife, heart hammering, staring at the spot where he had been. I didn't sleep again after that. At first light, I packed up my gear and left. I hiked faster than I ever had before, my eyes darting constantly to the trees, my ears straining for any sound. The trail felt different now, less like a path and more like a trap, winding deeper into the wilderness. Every few minutes, I glanced back. Every few minutes, I thought I saw something. A shadow shifting, a figure slipping between trees. Never close, never fully visible. But there, by the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. I threw my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Then, finally, I looked up, and my blood ran cold, because at the edge of the parking lot, just before the tree line, he was there, still watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine, slammed it into reverse, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying under my tires. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, because somehow I knew he was still watching. I first found the house by accident. It was late August, hot and dry, the air thick with the smell of warm pine needles and dust. I had been walking for hours, wandering further into the woods than I ever had before. There was no real reason for it. I liked exploring, being alone, and getting away from the hum of the town. The trails I usually stuck to felt too familiar, so I cut off into the trees and followed the land, wherever it wanted to take me. It was deeper than I had ever gone. The sounds of the highway were gone. Even the distant hum of farm equipment had faded. Just trees and dry leaves crunching under my boots. That's when I saw it. The house was old. More like a shack, really. The roof sagged in the middle, and parts of it had caved in, exposing the dark interior. The windows were empty, no glass, just gaping holes like empty eye sockets. The porch had mostly collapsed, the wooden boards brittle and gray. I should have turned around. There was no good reason to go inside. But I did anyway. It was bigger than it looked, with multiple rooms, though most of them were barely standing. Dust hung in the air, stirred by my footsteps. The floor creaked under my weight, and in some spots it felt soft, like the wood had been rotting from the inside out. The whole place smelled like old wood, dry rot, and something faintly metallic. Then I saw the sculptures. They were everywhere. The first one was in what used to be the front room, standing against the far wall. It was human-shaped, but not quite right, too tall, its limbs too thin. Its mouth was open in a wide, gaping O, like it had been caught mid-scream. The eyes were hollow, just deep pits in its face. I stepped closer. The material was rough, like clay or cement, but crumbling at the edges. Dust had settled into the cracks. Then I saw another, slumped in the corner. This one was smaller, curled in on itself, its arms wrapped around its knees like it was cowering. Its mouth was open too, the same dark void, like it had been screaming forever. There were more in the next room. Some standing, some sitting. A few had collapsed, their broken limbs scattered across the floor like dried bones. And every single one had those same empty eyes. It was clear someone had lived here once. There were old tools, rusted and forgotten, a workbench covered in dried-out clay, and shelves lined with jars full of thick, dried-up paint. Whoever had made these things had spent years doing it. A lifetime, maybe. It felt wrong to be in there. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or anything like that. But standing in that house, surrounded by those statues, I felt something I couldn't explain. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. I left in a hurry, my boots kicking up dust as I walked out. The light outside felt too bright after being in that place. The air too warm. I felt like I needed to shake something off, but I didn't know what. A few weeks later, my friend Matt found out about the place. I hadn't told anyone, I hadn't planned to, but one night, sitting around a fire, I mentioned it. Just a passing story, something weird I had come across. Matt wanted to see it. I told him it wasn't worth it, that it was just an old shack falling apart in the woods. But he didn't listen. He wanted to go, and nothing was going to stop him. So we went. The house looked worse the second time. The roof had sagged even more, and part of the front wall had caved in. Dust hung in the air, thick enough that I could taste it. Matt thought it was incredible. I watched him walk through the place, staring at the sculptures like they were some kind of lost treasure. He ran his hands over the cracked surfaces, even picked up a few of the smaller broken pieces from the floor. Then he saw the one in the back. It was half buried in debris, knocked over by time and weather. But it was different from the others. Its mouth was shut, its hands reaching out like it was trying to grab something. He pulled it out of the rubble, brushing the dirt away. It wasn't huge, maybe 2 feet tall, but heavy, made of something dense. He held it up and grinned. "I'm keeping this," he said. I should have told him to leave it. I don't know why I didn't. A month later, he drowned. It happened at the lake. We had all gone out there for one of the last warm weekends of the season. The water was low, the summer heat baking the muddy shoreline. I remember Matt walking up to the edge, staring at the water. He stepped in, took about 2 steps, then backed out. "It's too murky," he said. "I don't like it." It was weird. He'd never been weird about the water before, but something about it made him uncomfortable. He stood on the shore, watching the rest of us swim, barely saying a word. The next time he went to the lake, he didn't come back. It was a week later. I wasn't there. He went with a different group, some friends from work. He waded into the water, same as before. Only this time he kept going. Then he was gone. They said it happened fast. 1 second he was standing waist deep, the next he was underwater. No splashing, no struggle, just gone. They found his body 2 days later, caught in some submerged branches near the drop-off. The autopsy said he drowned, simple as that. No injuries, no alcohol in his system, just bad luck. I went to his place after the funeral, helping his brother go through his things. That's when I saw it, the statue. It was sitting on his dresser, right where he had put it the day we brought it back. Same hollow eyes, same reaching hands. His brother didn't want it, didn't even ask where it came from. I took it, drove out to the woods that same night, back to where we had found it. I left it there, didn't go inside, didn't even look. Just set it down by what was left of the front wall and walked away. I haven't been back since, and I won't. Our family's summer house had always been a place of comfort. It wasn't exactly in the middle of nowhere, but it felt like it sometimes. The house sat between a dense patch of forest and a slow-moving river, far enough from the nearest town that the nights were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of an animal. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a creaky wooden deck, and an outdoor bonfire pit made of stacked stones. My parents had owned it for years, using it for weekend getaways, but that one summer, my siblings and I were left there alone for several weeks. We were teenagers then, old enough to take care of ourselves, but still young enough that the idea of being completely unsupervised felt like an adventure. No parents, no rules, just warm summer days spent swimming in the river and cool nights roasting marshmallows over the fire. We slept in late, stayed up even later, and for the most part, those weeks passed in a lazy blur of freedom. Until the morning we found the hair. It was my brother who saw it first. I had just woken up, still groggy, and was sitting on the deck stretching when I heard him call my name. There was something in his voice that made me stop mid-yawn. He wasn't laughing or messing around like usual. He sounded off. I walked over to where he was standing, just a few feet from the bonfire pit. My sister was already there, standing still, staring at something. I followed their gaze. The fire pit wasn't empty like it had been the night before. In the center, half covered in gray ash, was a mound of something dark. At first, I thought it was burnt grass or maybe some kind of animal fur. But when I stepped closer, I realized what it really was. Hair. Human hair. The pile was massive, enough to fill a medium-sized pillow, long strands of brown, straight hair clumped together, some of it still curled at the ends from whatever fire had burned it. But it hadn't burned completely. The edges were singed, some pieces blackened, others left untouched. A faint trail of smoke still curled from the mass, mixing with the sharp smell of burnt keratin. None of us spoke. We just stood there, staring. It wasn't there the night before. We would have seen it. Someone had been here. While we slept, a slow, crawling sense of unease started in my gut and spread outward. The summer house wasn't exactly in a high-traffic area. No one ever just happened to pass by. The river was too shallow for boats, and the nearest road was half a mile away. We hadn't heard anything, no footsteps, no car engines, nothing. And yet, someone had come. Someone had stood right here, just feet from where we slept, and set fire to what looked like years' worth of hair. I remember my mind racing through possible explanations, none of them good. A serial killer destroying evidence? Some kind of weird cult ritual? My brother stepped forward and prodded the pile with a stick, shifting the strands. More smoke curled up, and the smell intensified, something between burnt paper and an overused hair straightener. My sister gagged and turned away. We didn't know what to do. Calling the police felt extreme. It wasn't a crime to burn hair, even if it was disturbing as hell. And what would we even say? "Hi, we found a pile of burnt hair in our fire pit. Please investigate." We weren't even sure if it was human hair, though deep down we all knew. The texture, the length, it was unmistakable. We ended up calling our parents. My dad answered, groggy from sleep, and after we explained what we'd found, there was a long pause. Then he sighed. I'll never forget what he said next. "Oh, that must have been your aunt. Our weird aunt. The one none of us saw much outside of family gatherings. The one who never let anyone touch her hair, who always had it pulled back in a long, tight braid. The one who never let hairdressers near her and insisted on trimming it herself in private. Apparently, she had some kind of superstition. She believed that if someone else got hold of her hair, they could use it against her, control her, curse her, something along those lines. So instead of throwing away the clippings after she cut her own hair, she collected them. For years. And then, when she had enough, she burned them. She never told anyone where or when she did it. She just showed up, burned her hair, and left. I remember standing there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the smoking pile in the fire pit. She came here. I asked. In the middle of the night? My dad sighed again, like this was just one of those things that happened, like it was an annoying but harmless quirk. She probably didn't want to wake you kids up. You know how she is. That was the end of the conversation. There was nothing else to say. We cleaned up the pit as best we could, using sticks to push the hair deeper into the ash, making sure nothing was left smoldering. But even after it was gone, the unease lingered. It wasn't just the fact that she had come in the night without telling us. It was the thought of her standing there, alone in the dark, feeding handfuls of her own hair into the fire, watching it burn. What else did she believe? And more importantly, what else did she do that we didn't know about? West Virginia has a way of making you feel like you're the last person on Earth. Deep in those hills, miles from any town, it's just thick forest, rocky trails, and the occasional clearing where an old homestead used to be. You get out far enough, and the world feels untouched, like time just gave up trying to keep up with the land. That's what I loved about it. That's why we rode there. Me and my buddies, Jared, Matt, and Cody, had been riding four-wheelers in Lincoln County for years. The old logging roads up there crisscrossed for miles, connecting to the Hatfield-McCoy trails. You could ride all day, see maybe one or two other people if you were lucky. It was our favorite way to kill a weekend. Just the four of us, a cooler full of beer, and nowhere to be. We'd been riding since early that morning, following trails we half remembered from past trips, taking turns leading, stopping every now and then to stretch our legs and figure out where the hell we were. The trails had a way of looking the same after a while. Ruts from old logging trucks, thick brush pressing in from both sides, deep mud in the low spots that could swallow a four-wheeler if you weren't careful. It was around midday when we found the cabin. It sat just off the trail, maybe 30 yards back in the trees. An old log structure, probably built back in the early 1900s. The roof was still mostly intact, but the front porch was sagging, and the whole thing had that look of a place that hadn't been touched in a long, long time. You find places like that sometimes out here, old hunting cabins, maybe an old homestead from before these hills emptied out. Usually they're full of rusted tools, broken furniture, maybe a few old bottles if you're lucky. We figured it was as good a place as any to take a break. Pulled our four-wheelers off the trail, cracked open some beers, and dug into the snacks we'd packed. It was quiet out there. No wind, no sound of running water, just the occasional buzz of insects and the distant sound of a woodpecker hammering away somewhere in the trees. That's when I noticed the apple tree. It was off to the side of the cabin, maybe 20 feet away. Looked old, the kind of tree that had probably been there long before the cabin had started falling apart. Most of the branches were bare, just twisted limbs reaching out in all directions, but I thought I saw a few apples hanging up near the top. Curious, I walked over to check it out. As I got closer, I realized those weren't apples. They were mice, dozens of them, dangling from the branches by pieces of fishing line, their little bodies swinging slightly in the still air. At first, my brain didn't know how to process what I was looking at. It didn't make sense. Who the hell would do something like this? I stepped in closer, and the smell hit me, rot mixed with something sour. The mice were in various states of decay. Some were fresh, their little paws curled inward, their fur still mostly intact. Others were just skin and bone, their skulls exposed, empty eye sockets staring down. Some were barely more than skeletons, nothing left but a tangle of tiny bones and dried up bits of flesh. It took me a second to realize they all looked the same. Flattened, like they'd been caught in mouse traps, then brought out here, strung up one by one. There had to be 50, maybe 100 of them, hanging at different heights, some close together, others spaced out like ornaments on a Christmas tree. Someone had tied little knots around their necks, looped the fishing line around the branches, and just left them. I felt my stomach turn. Who does this? And why? I took a step back, looking around suddenly, feeling exposed. I didn't like the thought of someone being out here, doing something this strange. It didn't feel like some bored kid messing around. It felt intentional, deliberate. I waved the guys over. They came up, laughing about something. But the second they saw what I was pointing at, the mood shifted. Jared swore under his breath. Matt just stared. Cody took a step back, shaking his head. None of us knew what to say. The longer we stood there, the worse it felt. The whole place suddenly felt wrong. Like we had just walked into a crime scene or something we weren't supposed to see. We didn't talk about it. We just left. Finished our beers, packed up, got back on our four-wheelers. Rode out of there faster than we normally would, pushing the machines hard, not stopping to check the map or take a breather. Just riding, trying to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. I didn't stop thinking about it, though. Even after we got back to the trucks, loaded up, and started heading home, it stayed with me. The image of that tree, those little bodies swinging in the breeze. Later that night, I tried to make sense of it. Went online, searched for anything similar. Closest thing I could find was old folklore, stuff about witches, old Appalachian superstitions. Hanging dead animals from trees to ward off spirits, that kind of thing. But this wasn't some 100-year-old tradition. Those mice were fresh. Someone was still doing this. And the more I thought about it, the worse it got. Because whoever was doing it had to come back. Had to bring more. Had to be out there, somewhere, walking those same trails, catching more mice, tying more knots. And if they had been out there recently enough for those fresh ones to still be swinging in the wind, then maybe they had seen us, too. I don't know how to start this story because even thinking about it makes my hands shake a little. This happened years ago, but it still lingers in my mind. The images, the fear, the overwhelming sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. That I saw something I shouldn't have seen. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. Not in the way horror movies show it. No ghosts, no monsters. Just real, raw fear. Fear of the unknown. It started as a simple camping and hiking trip. I was out in the wilderness with two of my close friends. We had been planning this for a long time, just a chance to get away from everything, disconnect from work, from the internet, from people. Just us in the woods, miles away from civilization. We had chosen a remote area, far from any towns, and even further from any official campsites. The kind of place where you wouldn't expect to see another person for days, maybe even weeks. It was a vast stretch of wilderness, with thick forests, rocky hills, and long stretches of open land. It was beautiful, peaceful. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. For the first few days, everything went perfectly. We hiked through deep woods, crossed icy streams, and set up camp in places that felt untouched by man. The silence out there was something else. The only sounds were the wind through the trees, the distant calls of birds, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush from some unseen animal. Then came the fourth day. We had decided to take a longer hike that day, traveling further from camp to explore an area we had seen on the map. It was a massive clearing, a field that stretched far into the distance. It was strange to see something like that out here, where the land was mostly dense forest and rugged terrain. The grass was short, the land almost perfectly flat, like it had been cleared deliberately a long time ago. We walked across it, joking about how weird it looked. It was too big, too open. It felt unnatural. I remember looking around and getting this odd feeling in my gut, like we were exposed. Like we had walked into a place we weren't supposed to be. And then we heard it, a deep, low thudding sound. At first, we thought it was distant thunder, but the sky was clear. Then the sound grew louder. Closer. A helicopter. Not just any helicopter. A large, black military-style helicopter. It came from the far side of the clearing, emerging from beyond the tree line. We stopped walking, staring as it approached. It wasn't flying high like normal helicopters do. It was low, uncomfortably low, like it was searching for something, or someone. For a few seconds, we just stood there, watching as it got closer. And then we saw them. Men, dressed in black, hanging off the side of the helicopter, armed. They were wearing gas masks. They were pointing their rifles at us. That was the moment the fear hit. The deep, gut-wrenching kind of fear. The kind that doesn't let you think straight. We had no idea what was happening, but we knew one thing. We were in danger. We froze, hands slightly raised, staring up at them. The helicopter hovered just above the ground, the sound of the rotors deafening. I could feel the force of the wind it was kicking up, dust and grass swirling around us. They didn't speak. They didn't explain. They just motioned aggressive hand signals that were impossible to misunderstand. They were telling us to turn around, to leave. Immediately. We didn't argue. We didn't hesitate. We turned. We ran. The helicopter stayed there for a moment, watching us, making sure we were leaving. Then it veered off, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But we didn't stop running. We sprinted across that open field, back towards the tree line, back towards the forest. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could still hear the sound of the helicopter fading into the distance, but I didn't trust that it was really gone. We ran for what felt like forever, through trees, over rocks, past our original path. We didn't stop until we reached our campsite. We didn't even talk. We just packed. Fast. None of us wanted to spend another night out there. Whatever that was, whoever they were, we didn't want to risk them coming back. It took us a couple of hours to pack everything up and start the long hike back to our car. The sun was setting as we reached it, the sky a deep orange, but I didn't feel relieved. Not yet. We got in and started driving, still silent, still processing what had just happened. None of us spoke for at least an hour. It was like our brains were trying to catch up with the reality of what we had seen. Eventually, someone broke the silence. What the hell was that? No one had an answer. We tried to rationalize it, to come up with some kind of logical explanation. Military training exercise? Maybe. But then why the gas masks? Why the guns? Why were they so aggressive? Were we near some kind of hidden facility? Some place we weren't supposed to know about? Some place that didn't exist on any map? None of it made sense. And the worst part, the fear didn't fade when we got home. For weeks, I kept thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The men in black, the helicopter, the way they stared at us through those cold, featureless masks. We never talked to anyone about it. Never reported it. We didn't want to. We didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. Because deep down, I think we all knew. We had seen something we weren't supposed to see. And I still wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't left?